11 caregivers had walked out of the Ashcroft estate in less than 4 months, and the 12th application sat untouched on the kitchen counter until a man named Orion Hale knocked on the door at 11:50 at night. Rain fell steadily over the hills above Seattle. The kind of cold autumn rain that soaked through wool coats and made porch lights flicker behind curtains of mist. The housekeeper, Vera Quinn, opened the door, expecting no one, since the agency had already told her that no one wanted the job anymore. Word had spread through every home health company in the city. Nobody could handle the woman upstairs. Nobody could survive her silence, her fury, or the particular exhaustion of caring for someone who had given up on being cared for at all. Orion stood on the doorstep with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a folder of paperwork so thin it looked almost apologetic. He did not smile. He did not explain himself. He simply asked if the position was still open. And when Vera hesitated, he added that he understood if it was too late to start tonight. Something about the way he said it, calm and unhurried, made her step aside and let him in anyway. She led him through a hallway lined with photographs of a woman none of the staff recognized anymore. Not really, because photographs freeze people at their strongest moment, and the woman upstairs bore no resemblance to any of them. Vera studied him as they walked, trying to place what made him different from the 11 who had come before. He was not young. His hands were rough in the way that came from years of physical work rather than a gym membership. He carried himself the way soldiers sometimes did long after they had left the service, upright but unhurried. As though he had learned somewhere along the way that panic rarely solved anything a steady hand could not. She asked him, almost without meaning to, why he wanted a job that had already broken 11 other people. He told her that he did not think anyone had actually tried to understand what Celeste needed. They had only tried to manage her. And there was a difference between the two that most people never learned. The agency file on him, thin as it was, listed nothing unusual. A long stretch of military medical service, a period running a small private rehabilitation clinic outside Tacoma, closed several years earlier for reasons the file did not specify. No disciplinary complaints, no notable achievements, nothing that would explain why a man with his background would take an overnight position paying far less than his experience could command elsewhere. Vera had learned, over years of managing the household, that the people who mattered most rarely announced themselves loudly, and something about the quiet economy of Orion's answers told her this was one of those times. Celeste Ashcroft had once been the kind of executive that business magazines built entire issues around. She had taken a mid-sized logistics company and turned it into a name recognized on 3 continents. She had walked into boardrooms and left grown men reconsidering their own competence. Then a helicopter carrying her from a conference outside Tacoma had gone down in a stretch of forest 20 miles from any road. And when the rescue teams pulled her from the wreckage 6 hours later, the woman who emerged was no longer able to move anything below her collarbone. The doctors called it a spinal injury, with an uncertain prognosis. Celeste called it the end of everything she had built her identity around, and in the months since, she had made sure that everyone around her understood exactly how she felt about it. Vera walked Orion up the wide staircase, past a window that looked out over the lights of the city far below, and stopped outside a door at the end of the hall. She lowered her voice and told him what she told every new hire, though by now the warning felt more like a formality than useful information. The last caregiver had lasted 3 hours. The one before that had lasted a single overnight shift before quitting by text message at 4 in the morning. Celeste did not want help. She wanted to be left alone in the dark, and anyone who tried to change that arrangement usually regretted it. Orion listened without reaction, then asked a question that stopped Vera halfway through turning the doorknob. He wanted to know whether Celeste still wanted to live like a chief executive, or whether she had decided to live like a patient instead. Vera did not have an answer, because no one had thought to frame the question that way before. She opened the door and stepped back, letting him walk in alone. The room was dim, lit only by the blue glow of a monitor tracking vitals. Nobody was watching closely enough. Celeste lay in a hospital bed that had been fitted into the corner of what used to be a study. Her dark hair spread across the pillow. Her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She heard the door and did not turn her head. "Get out," she said, her voice flat and utterly without warmth. "I did not ring for anyone." Orion set his bag down near the door and did not move closer. He introduced himself simply, gave his name and nothing else. No resume recitation. No reassurances about his qualifications. Celeste turned her eyes toward him then, taking in the plain jacket, the tired posture of a man who had clearly worked long hours for most of his life, the absence of the practiced sympathy she had come to despise in every face that walked through that door. "You will not last until sunrise," she told him. "None of them do. If I leave," he said, "it will be because you stopped fighting. Not because you scared me." For the first time in weeks, Celeste had nothing to say. The silence stretched long enough that the monitor's soft beeping became the only sound in the room. And in that silence, Orion moved toward the bed. Not to touch her, but to study the machinery surrounding it. He crouched by the base of the hospital bed and ran his fingers along a bracket that had been installed at the wrong angle. His expression did not change, but something in the way he tilted his head told anyone paying attention that he had already found something wrong, something that every doctor and nurse and specialist who had passed through that room in 4 months had somehow missed. He did not tell Celeste what he saw. He simply reached for a small notepad in his jacket pocket and began writing, and outside the door, Vera Quinn stood frozen, wondering exactly what kind of caregiver had just walked into her employer's house at midnight. Over the following hour, Orion moved through the room like a man conducting an inspection, rather than beginning a shift. He checked the incline of the mattress and found it set 2 degrees off what any spinal rehabilitation protocol would recommend. He checked the medication schedule taped to the wall and noticed that the pain management dosage had been increased twice in the last month, without any corresponding decrease in physical therapy, a combination that would slowly weaken muscle tone rather than preserve it. He checked the room's lighting and noted that the overhead fixture buzzed faintly, a frequency most people stopped consciously hearing after a while, but which disrupted deep sleep all the same. Celeste watched him work without asking what he was doing, though her eyes followed him with a kind of guarded curiosity she had not felt toward a stranger in a long time. At one point she asked, with more sarcasm than genuine interest, whether he intended to fix her the same way he was fixing her furniture. He answered, without looking up from the bed frame, that furniture healed faster than people, but the principle was the same. Nothing recovered properly if it was set up wrong from the start. He worked methodically, checking the pressure points along her mattress, where prolonged stillness could damage skin and circulation, testing the responsiveness of the call button that had apparently gone unanswered on more than one occasion under previous staff, and noting, with a slight frown, that the room's humidity level was low enough to aggravate the kind of respiratory strain common in patients who spent most of their day lying flat. None of it was dramatic. None of it required a medical degree. It simply required someone willing to notice. When Dr. Elias Rowan, her longtime neurologist, arrived the following morning and found several of his instructions had been quietly adjusted, he was not pleased. He found Orion in the kitchen drinking black coffee and demanded to know who had given him authority to alter a treatment plan he had spent months designing. Orion did not raise his voice. He explained, briefly and without condescension, that he had not changed any medication or any clinical order. He had only changed the things within his control as a caregiver. The bed angle, the lighting, the noise level, the position of pillows, supporting Celeste's shoulders through the night. Dr. Rowan wanted to argue further, but something about the quiet certainty in Orion's answer made him pause instead, and he left the kitchen with more questions than he had walked in with. That first night, Celeste slept nearly 6 hours without waking, the longest unbroken rest she had managed since the accident. When she opened her eyes the next morning, sunlight filtering weakly through the curtains Orion had left slightly parted, she noticed something unfamiliar in her own body, a heaviness in her limbs that felt less like paralysis and more like the ordinary fatigue of a person who had actually slept. She did not mention it to anyone. She was not ready to admit that anything had changed. By the 3rd day, Celeste had decided that the best way to drive Orion out, the way she had driven out 11 caregivers before him, was to make herself as unbearable as possible. She knocked a cup of water from her bedside table with a sharp movement of her elbow, soaking a stack of paperwork Graham Wexler had left for her signature. She snapped at Orion when he adjusted her pillows, told him his hands were too rough, then told him the opposite an hour later. She ordered him out of the room 4 separate times in a single afternoon, and each time he simply stepped into the hallway, waited a few minutes, and returned without a word of protest. Vera Quinn watched this pattern from a distance and expected to find him gone by dinner. Instead, she found him in the kitchen preparing a meal exactly the way the nutritionist had specified months earlier. A specification that had been ignored by nearly every previous caregiver in favor of whatever was fastest. On the 4th night, Celeste tried a different tactic. She told Orion that she did not need him, that his presence in her home was an insult to the life she used to have, that a man who had probably spent his career changing bedpans in some understaffed clinic had no business pretending he understood anything about her. Orion set down the water glass he had been refilling and looked at her directly for the first time that evening. "I am not here to be liked," he said. "I am here to help you take your life back. If that offends you, I understand. But I am not leaving because you are unkind to me." Celeste opened her mouth to respond and found that nothing came out. For the first time since the accident, someone in that house had refused to either flatter her or flee from her, and the absence of both reactions left her strangely unmoored. She turned her face toward the window and said nothing more that night. And Orion adjusted her blankets in silence before dimming the lights and taking his seat in the chair near the door, where he would remain until morning, as he had every night since he arrived. Over the days that followed, Celeste kept testing him in smaller, quieter ways, as though she needed repeated proof before she would allow herself to believe it. She asked him sharp questions designed to embarrass him, about his failed clinic, about whether he had ever actually helped anyone recover, or simply told himself comforting stories about his own usefulness. Orion answered each question honestly, without defensiveness, admitting that his clinic had closed because he had spent more on patients who could not pay than the business could sustain, a fact he stated plainly, without asking for sympathy. Celeste had expected him to flinch under her questions. Instead, he answered them the way a man answers questions about the weather. And slowly, without either of them acknowledging it directly, the sharpness in her voice began to soften into something closer to genuine curiosity. 2 floors below, in an office that had once belonged to Celeste and now functioned as the temporary command center for the entire Ashcroft Dynamics operation, Naomi Pierce sat reviewing quarterly figures with an unease she had not felt in months. Naomi had stepped into the role of acting chief executive the week after the accident, a role she had performed with quiet competence and increasing comfort. She had grown used to the corner office, the deference of the board, the particular weight of authority that came with being the only person capable of making decisions for a company as large as Ashcroft Dynamics. She had also grown used to the assumption, unspoken but widely shared among the executive team, that Celeste would likely never fully recover, and that the company's future rested with whoever occupied the chief executive's chair in the meantime. Word had reached Naomi that morning that the new caregiver, a man with an unremarkable resume and almost no online footprint, had already made changes to Celeste's care regimen within his first day, and that Celeste had slept longer than she had in months. It was, on its surface, good news. Naomi did not receive it that way. She sat with the report for a long moment, then picked up her phone and made a call to someone outside the house, asking them, in careful and deliberately vague language, to keep an eye on the new hire and report back anything unusual. She told herself it was simple due diligence, the kind of caution any responsible executive would exercise when a stranger gained access to the most vulnerable member of the family. She did not examine too closely why the thought of Celeste's recovery made her stomach tighten instead of loosen. Naomi had not always been the kind of person who calculated advantage out of tragedy. She had joined the company years earlier as an operations analyst, promoted steadily through genuine competence, admired by colleagues for her precision and her willingness to work longer hours than anyone else in her department. Somewhere in the months since the accident, though, Comfort had crept in where caution used to live, and she had begun quietly mistaking the temporary authority she now held for something she had actually earned. She told herself the company ran more smoothly under her hand than it ever had under Celeste's more mercurial leadership, and there were days she almost believed it. But belief, she was slowly learning, was a fragile thing to build an entire identity upon, especially when the person whose chair she occupied was still, technically, breathing in a room 2 floors above her office. By the end of the first week, Orion had reorganized nearly every aspect of Celeste's daily routine. He replaced the passive stretching sessions that Dr. Rowan's team had been running with a more deliberate program built around neurological stimulation, small repeated signals meant to coax dormant pathways back into activity. He introduced breathing exercises that Celeste found humiliating at first, childish even, until she noticed that her chest no longer felt as tight by the end of each session. He spent long stretches simply talking with her, not about her company or her injury, but about ordinary things: the weather, a book left open on her nightstand, the particular way rain sounded against old windows, conversations that asked nothing of her, and therefore, over time, made her willing to give a little more. On the 6th day, while adjusting the position of her right hand against a folded towel, Orion noticed her index finger twitch. He said nothing at first, wanting to be certain it was not simply muscle spasm, the kind of involuntary movement that sometimes occurred in paralyzed limbs and meant nothing at all. He watched closely for the rest of the session, and when he asked her, gently, to try to move the finger on purpose, Celeste stared at her own hand with an expression somewhere between disbelief and fear, as though she did not trust herself to hope. She tried. The finger twitched again, faint but unmistakable. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Celeste turned her face away, and Orion realized she was crying, silently. The first tears anyone in that house had seen her shed since the accident. Dr. Rowan, informed of the movement the next morning, examined her hand for nearly 20 minutes before admitting, with visible reluctance, that he could not fully explain the improvement given her scan results from 2 months earlier. He asked Orion detailed questions about his methods, questions Orion answered patiently, though he made clear that he claimed no miracle, only the slow accumulation of consistency, rest, and stimulation that her previous care had lacked. Naomi, informed of the same development through the household staff, did not share the room's cautious hope. She sat alone in Celeste's old office that evening, long after the rest of the staff had gone home, staring at the city lights through the window, calculating what a full recovery would mean for every decision she had made in the past 4 months, every deal she had signed in Celeste's absence, every relationship she had quietly cultivated with board members who had grown comfortable answering to her instead. That same night, a member of the household staff, who worked the overnight cleaning shift, noticed a light on in the records room down the hall from the main office, a room that held years of physical files predating the company's move to digital storage. She did not think much of it until she mentioned it in passing to Vera the next morning. And Vera, remembering something Orion had said about paying attention to small details, decided to check the security footage herself. What she found unsettled her enough that she brought it directly to Orion rather than to anyone else in the house. The footage showed a figure entering the records room a few minutes after midnight, moving with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, and leaving less than 10 minutes later carrying a folder that had not been visible when they entered. Orion asked to see the footage himself, and watched it twice before saying anything. He told Vera to keep this between the two of them for now, and though she wanted to press him for an explanation, something in his expression convinced her to trust his judgment. Whatever he had noticed, he was not yet ready to say it out loud. The second week brought a different kind of tension into the house. Celeste, buoyed by the small victory of her finger's movement, began pushing herself harder during their sessions, sometimes past the point Orion advised, frustrated by how slowly her body responded compared to how quickly she wanted it to. There were mornings she refused to try at all, convinced the previous day's progress had been an illusion, and mornings she pushed so hard she exhausted herself before noon. Orion adjusted around her moods without complaint, neither indulging her worst days nor pretending her best days meant the fight was over. There were mornings when Celeste woke convinced that the previous day's progress had been a trick of exhaustion, a temporary illusion her body would take back the moment she tried to prove it again. On those mornings, she refused to leave the bed at all, turning her face to the wall and telling Orion, in a voice stripped of its usual sharpness,